I dive in, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Apis Tactical. Apis Tactical is a new American beekeeping brand that is bringing innovative designs to beekeeping protective gear. They just launched a new glove and there is more to come. Sponsorships like this help me freely talk about important topics in the beekeeping industry. Thanks Apis Tactical for the support. Please check them out, link in the description. Hello everyone. In today's episode, I have the pleasure to speak with Dr. Dave Goulson. Dr. Goulson is a professor of biology at the University of Sussex, specializing in bee ecology, with more than 300 scientific articles published and several books that some of you might have read already, such as the eye-opening book Silent Earth, describing the insect decline in a majestic way. Dr. Goulson was the perfect researcher to discuss one of my favorite subjects, pesticides. In this episode, we discuss his career, his new book for children called Insectarium, the problems with the modern agriculture and its growing dependency on pesticides, how the pesticide industry tries to silence the researchers who talk about the subject, and other topics. And now, I introduce to you Dr. Dave Goulson. Professor Goulson, thank you very much for your time to be here today in the show. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Aside from the appalling, endless rain we're suffering at the moment, life isn't so bad.
Okay, good. There is so much that I want to cover in this interview. First of all, it is an honor to have you here, and I want to introduce you to my audience. So I think the best way to go on that is to ask you about how you start with your career, how you become the entomologist that you are today. You know, I'm always curious how people, the life stories about people and what triggers you, what kind of curiosities that happens in your life that make you become so interested in those insects to the point that you are fighting for them.
Yeah, it's a good question. The honest truth is I don't really know where it came from, but from an early age, when I remember one of my earlier memories when I was about 6 is at lunchtime at school. For some reason, I saw these caterpillars feeding on some weeds around the edge of the playground, and I collected them up and put them in my empty lunchbox and took them home and reared them up. I think most of them died, but eventually I persevered, and one or two of them survived and turned into moths. Actually, these really beautiful red and black moths we call cinnabar moths. And I just thought that whole transformation and everything was kind of like magic. And I've been hooked ever since. You know, I collected butterflies as a kid. I'm embarrassed to admit, and stuck pins through them, but learned a lot about them. And I never really wanted to do anything else other than chase around after insects. So I think I've been really lucky that, you know, I've managed to find a career doing exactly that. You know, people pay me. My university pays me to wander around finding out interesting stuff about bees. You know, that's a pretty good life if you ask me.
Yes, it is. And you're doing a fantastic job, Professor. So how you end up at the university?
My current
Sussex, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have moved around a fair bit. I don't know. I get bored in one place for too long, but I've been at Sussex University on the south coast of the UK for 11 years now, and I think I might be here for the duration. And but it's from a UK perspective, the southeast is the warmest and therefore the most insect-rich corner of the country, which was part of the appeal. Helps by the fact that my wife is from this part of the world as well. So,
and how the university is treating you?
They're pretty good, actually. Yeah, and it's quite nice that there's a lot of us that work on insects. It isn't just me, which is a rare thing. You know, there are many more people that study birds or mammals or whatever than are insects, even though insects make up the bulk of life on Earth. So it's nice to be somewhere which has a real insect focus. We have people that work on ants and hoverflies and wasps and all sorts here, as well as obviously me and the bees.
Good. You wrote so many books, and there is a new one coming that I want you to introduce to us. Insectarium. What is that book about, Professor?
Insectarium.
Insectarium. I'm putting here at the
I'm not
screen.
putting it up. Yeah, I was just going to wave one up.
Okay. Oh, is it?
It's a different color in the US for some reason. I don't know why, but it's the same book. It's really a children's book, although I hope it would be interesting to adults too. But it's a kind of tour of the world's insects, beautifully illustrated by an artist called Emily Carter, and with words by me. So I basically picked about 200 of what I thought were the world's weirdest, most beautiful, most fascinating insects. So there's all sorts of strange things in there from all around the world. Some of them ones you might see in your own garden, and others you might have to go to somewhere really exotic to see. But I hope it will help to inspire another generation of insect enthusiasts. That's the idea.
No, that's great. I think people can find to pre-order on Amazon here already. So if you guys want to be interested, please go to Amazon right now and grab your copy and give it to your kids. Start to educate them about the importance of these insects that, unfortunately, are going to jump right into the next subject of this conversation. Insects are in trouble, and I wanna get this conversation going in that direction, Professor, because you have been one of the warriors out there trying to educate people about these problems that we have. And I want to ask you, how bad is the situation? Can you give us an overview about how bad is the die-off of all the insects that we have in all this mass amount of losses we have?
Sure. I mean, I suppose I should first kind of preempt what I'm going to say by admitting that there are lots of knowledge gaps because there are so many species of insect in the world.
Yeah.
We've named over 1 million species, and it's estimated that there may be as many as another 5 or more million that we haven't even given a name to yet. So we clearly haven't got any idea how those insects are faring if we haven't even discovered them. And even the ones we have named, most of them we don't have data for. But that aside, we do have long-term studies from parts of North America and many European countries, and pretty much all of them show the same thing, which is decline. The best estimate we have is that globally insects are declining by between 1% and 2% a year, which you might immediately think, well, that doesn't sound very much. But this has been happening probably for the best part of 100 years, maybe more than 100 years. Certainly, so the long-term data we have, the long-term studies start in the 70s and some of them in the 80s. So we're only really probably looking at the tail end of insect declines that we have data for. But some of those studies show really terrifying losses. So, for example, one German study using malaise traps, which catch flying insects, and they did that all over Germany over a 26-year period, and found that the catch in their traps, the biomass of insects caught, fell by 76%. So in 26 years, so 3/4 of the flying insects disappeared from German sites in a quarter of a century, basically. And as I say, that is certainly, these declines didn't begin 26 years ago. They probably began a lot longer. The honest truth is we don't know what proportion of insects we've lost in total, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably more than 90% in terms of abundance, which is pretty terrifying given that they do loads of really vital stuff, which mostly is completely unappreciated by people. In fact, most people don't really like insects, if they're honest. They never pay any attention to them. Their reaction if an insect comes near them, unless it's a butterfly, is usually one of horror and flapping around trying to kill it. And about the only thing most people have noticed is that their car windshield stays clean when they go for a long drive in the summer. And if you're as old as me, you can remember a time when you had to stop to clean the windshield because it was covered in bug splats. That just doesn't happen anymore. But as far as most people are concerned, that's pretty much all they've registered. But sadly, we will all feel the consequences if we allow insects to continue to disappear, because whether we like them or not, we all need them because of the stuff they do. And the best known thing, of course, is pollination, but they do a whole host of other things too, which are maybe just as important, like being food for most food chains. All the beautiful birds that people like to see, most of them feed on insects. Bats, lots of amphibians, mammals, reptiles, all feed on insects. So if the insects go, they all go. And then they recycle. They're really important in nutrient cycles, in recycling dung, dead bodies, dead leaves, tree trunks, keeping the soil healthy, distributing seeds, helping to control pests. They do just this whole amazing amount of stuff in ecosystems that means that essentially ecosystems would collapse without insects. And, we don't know when that might happen, but at the rate we're going, it could be soon.
Yeah. But what's killing them?
Well, I think everyone agrees that it's complicated. There are lots of factors at play. It's not just one. Fairly obvious things like habitat loss, cutting down of tropical rainforests, which are incredibly biodiverse, and replacing them with fields of soybean or cattle ranches is obviously massively detrimental to biodiversity of all types. So habitat loss is one. The way farming has changed, the move to ultra-intensive farming regimes, which don't really leave much room at all for any kind of life other than the crop, has been hugely harmful. And a critical part of that has been the adoption of pesticides, particularly insecticides, on a massive scale around the globe. Farmers managed without them until the 1940s. They were introduced at the tail end of the Second World War. We have such a diversity of pesticides available to farmers now that really it's very hard to keep up. Of course, famously, Rachel Carson flagged up the impact of pesticides in her book Silent Spring in 1962. And actually at the time it was very controversial, and eventually the pesticides she was most concerned about were banned. But since then, hundreds of new pesticides have been invented to replace things like DDT and the organophosphates that used to be used. And many of them, from an insect's perspective, are much more toxic to insects than DDT ever was. Essentially, insects attempting to live on farmland these days are exposed to a blizzard of chemicals, many of them specifically designed to kill insects, which it makes it hardly surprising that there aren't many insects to be found on farmland these days. But then to complete the story about insect declines, there are lots of other things too. Fertilizers are having impacts, light pollution, climate change is really starting to kick in, invasive species are causing problems. There's this whole, it's like a perfect storm of problems, all of them man-made, of course. Insects are pretty adaptable. They're amazing creatures. They've been around for about 480 million years. That means they're amongst the oldest animals on the planet, on land anyway, twice as old as the oldest dinosaurs. And they survived all the other mass extinction events that have come and gone, when the dinosaurs were wiped out 65 million years ago by a meteor. I'm sure some insects went extinct, but plenty made it through. But they're struggling now, and, we know exactly who's to blame. It's down to us.
That's a big sign. I start to get concerned about that. Working with the honeybees as a beekeeper myself, from a second generation beekeeper in my family, I clearly remember how hard it was for a honeybee hive to die. Maybe I'm too old, and the new generation don't even understand what I'm seeing, or the older generation of beekeepers have the same opinion that I have. It was very hard In the past, the problems we got was to have too many bees because they were tough and we didn't know
Yeah,
what to do with them.
they're pretty resilient creatures, aren't they? I mean,
Yes.
incredible organisms, like kind of often described as a super organism. But life for them is pretty challenging these days. They're exposed. Well, first of all, they struggle to find many flowers, and there's not much diversity of flowers in much of the modern world. So their diet is very restricted, which probably isn't good for them. But then when they do find food, it's probably contaminated with a mixture of pesticides, which means that they're feeding their offspring on a mixture of pesticides. So right from the day they hatch from their egg, honeybees are chronically exposed. All bees are chronically exposed to a whole cocktail of pesticides, and we have a really poor understanding of all the ramifications of that. But obviously, at higher doses, it kills them. But at lower doses, it has all sorts of other complicated effects, like impairing their immune system, which then means that diseases like deformed wing virus that a healthy colony can easily cope with suddenly become much more of a problem, and the virus proliferates in bees that have been exposed to tiny doses of pesticide, for example. Pesticides can affect their fertility, so the queen lays fewer fertile eggs, and so on and so on. So it's we've gone out of our way almost, it seems, to make life difficult for these poor creatures, which is pretty dumb when we all know how important not just honeybees but all pollinating insects are to our food supply.
Yeah, and I start this, because of pesticides and also invasive species and things like tropicalaps coming from Asia and start to spread now. And nobody knew about those things before, but and then I start to educate myself a little bit more, and I got very, very concerned about how we handle regulatory issues about pesticides and the things that we know and the things that we don't know. But it's easy to, with the little things we know, it's easy to have a broader understanding that the problem might be much bigger than we think. And is the synergistic effect of those chemicals. As something that I think the regulatory agencies cannot regulate or predict, and it might be doing so much damage that we cannot see it, because there are hundreds of combinations out there now that impossible to track. And how can we track everything that's happening and make the connections to the point that we can say, look, this is the problem, let's get rid of this? That creates so many variables. And when you have these scenarios with so many variables, it's very easy for the pesticide industry to find ways to argue against and find excuses, I would say. But it's so obvious today. And we have so many data. It's not about the data anymore. And that's why I said I need to start talking about these things. People need to know that little combinations of things here and there, or a new pesticide that come in, just change the whole environment again. This new guy might interact with the old guy that's already there, and the other, is a snowball. And I wonder your thoughts on that synergistic effect. And are you concerned about these things? Because I'm terrified. I look at the water that I'm drinking. I'm thinking about these things, and now everywhere I go,
there's two really obvious massive failings of the whole regulatory process in all countries. The first is that, so most of the studies that are done to register a pesticide involve testing how toxic they are to different organisms, usually including honeybees. But it's usually a short-term test done over a few days, and it involves exposing otherwise healthy bees to one pesticide. The reality is, as I've already touched on, they're not just exposed for a few days, they're exposed for their whole life. And they're not just exposed to one pesticide, they're exposed to a constantly changing mixture. And of course, you could say exactly the same thing about us. You know, our food is contaminated with mostly the same pesticides that bee pollen and honey is contaminated with. So the regulatory system just completely ignores these issues because it can't deal with them. There's no practically, given that, I mean, in the United States, there are somewhere in the region of 1,000 different pesticides. And just for comparison, you know, when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, there were, I think, 37 pesticides available to farmers. Now there's 1,000. So imagine how many pairwise combinations of pesticides you'd have to study just to look at pairwise interactions. Far more than everyone could ever do. And then what about three-way, four-way? You know,
Yep.
so we have no clue what the long-term consequences of this is, other than it's probably not going to be good. And by chance, we've stumbled upon a few examples of synergisms between pesticides. So we do know that it is possible for a combination of two pesticides to be much worse than the sort of additive effect of them separately. So, for example, there are certain types of fungicide that on their own aren't really toxic at all, but they block the detoxification mechanisms of the bee, which is fine as long as the bee isn't exposed to anything toxic. But if the bee is simultaneously exposed to an insecticide, it can't break it down, it can't deal with it. And suddenly the pesticide can become 1,000 times more toxic because the bee's been exposed to a seemingly innocuous fungicide. That's just one example that emerged, but who knows how many others there are that nobody's yet picked up on. So the part of the problem is that it's difficult to know how to deal with this. You know, environmentalists will tend to latch onto one group of pesticides and blame everything on them. You know, there have been a few pesticides which have attracted disproportionate attention. Neonicotinoids in the bee world and glyphosate generally in sort of the environmental circles. And you get a campaign to ban them. And so the European Union banned neonicotinoids primarily over concern that they were poisoning bees. And I think they were right to do so. But it hasn't really solved the problems because they've just been replaced by new generations of insecticides, which are many of them just as bad, I think. So if we're just campaigning often to get something removed after it's been used for 20 or 30 years, and in the meantime, the companies manufacturing them, they know that pesticide X will eventually be banned. So they replace it with pesticide Y in the meantime. And when X goes, Y is rolled out and Z comes next. And we just go on using more and more pesticides. And so we might feel like we've won a battle, but we're losing the war. And it's challenging the whole system is clearly the way forward, you know, highlighting that it's not sustainable if we carry on down this avenue of industrialized farming with all these different chemicals. Ecosystems are collapsing, you know, insects are disappearing, soils are becoming degraded. If we carry on down this route, we're all going to starve, which is ironic because we're often told that industrial agriculture is needed to feed everybody.
Yeah.
And it has increased yields, there's no doubt about it. You know, during the 20th century, we massively increased crop yields, and that enabled the human population to grow to, 8 billion. There'll probably soon be 10 billion of us. And it's often argued that without all these chemicals, we couldn't feed the world. Actually, I think that's complete nonsense. The reality is there's tons of food. We're incredibly wasteful with food. We currently grow about 3 times as much as we actually need to feed the human population, but roughly a third of the food we grow gets thrown away and a third of it gets fed to animals. So we could actually move to a more sustainable, slightly lower yielding system of agriculture and easily feed everyone if we tackle the issues of waste and overconsumption of meat. But perhaps getting a bit away from bees here, but people shouldn't buy the argument that we need all these chemicals to feed us. I think if we carry on the way we're going, then we'll all starve.
What can you do about this? I was very optimistic about when I'm talking about this. I'm trying to motivate people to find other solutions, because we need to replace these things with something better, I'd say. Maybe RNAi. I was very optimistic about RNAi solutions. I don't know if you follow those, but those insecticides based on RNAi could be much more target oriented, but maybe I don't know too much. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I guess I'm slightly cynical. I don't know that much about them, is the honest truth. I mean, personally, I prefer more holistic, natural solutions to high-tech solutions where they're available, and they are available. You know, if we supported organic farming, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world of kind of regenerative agriculture, focusing on reducing or eliminating pesticide use, on reducing fertilizer use, on looking after soils and so on. So there's a lot of farmers doing some really cool stuff. And it doesn't necessarily involve, you know, the high tech, either RNA or, you know, GM crops or whatever. We can actually feed everyone without any of those things, is my view. I mean, just to focus on organic agriculture for a second, which isn't perhaps the answer, but it shows what's possible. There've been some big global studies that have looked at the yield of organic, so using no synthetic fertilizer, no synthetic insecticides, fungicides, and averaged across crops and regions, it's about 80% of conventional agriculture, but it's had almost no investment in research and development compared to the billions that have gone into developing pesticides and high yielding crop varieties and so on for industrial agriculture. With a bit of investment, I'm sure you could close that yield gap between organic and conventional, but it's not that big anyway. You know, small farms farmed organically could feed the world. And in fact, the majority of people in developing countries still get their food from small organic farms because the pesticides aren't that widely available in many countries. But there are alternatives. We're not. The difficulty with making any kind of progress is there's this massive industrial lobby standing in the way with
exactly.
The last thing they want is anything that's going to reduce the number or the amount of product they sell. You know, that's their business, is manufacturing and selling these things for industrial agriculture. So, suggesting we go organic, well, that's not going to work for them.
Exactly.
So everything to stop and to undermine any kind of movement that goes in that direction.
When I think about this problem, that's why I feel like in a capitalist world, we're gonna need to use capitalism to fight this problem. That's why I think we need to create something that will compete to replace them. I think organic is good. I think you are correct. If we decide as society, no, we want to move to a different direction, that would be great. But can we do that with only educating the majority of people? So that's why I was also thinking, how can I tackle this problem? How can I tackle this problem in a way that really is going to do a change? And that's why I think RNAi could be a potential. But then we're going to find out later on that RNAi have a problem too, and the cycle starts again.
That's the danger, isn't it? I mean, as I say, I don't think either of us is an expert on that approach. And the idea of a more specific insecticide, essentially, that just targets the pest sounds appealing, but the market's going to be much more limited. You know, most insecticides kill a huge swathe of insects, of all the pests and all the good insects in one go, which means that one pesticide can have lots of different uses on different crops and against different pests. But if you had to tailor your pesticide pest by pest, it's going to be much more expensive to do. Which is potentially going to mean farmers end up locked into a really high import, high output system. Maybe it could work. It's beyond my expertise to work out how we completely change the future of farming. But I do think we should all be questioning the way we're going at the moment, because it seems like a dead end to me.
It is a dead end for sure. I'm certain of that. And talking about that, the people that are able to talk about these things and people to listen, I would say academics and maybe people. Who is the people that can change things, Professor? I feel like people that work at EPA, if they speak more, or academics, if they speak more, we could create a case, a much stronger case. But I only see a very few people talking about that. And I remember reading your book, Silent Earth. You mentioned that you have problems when we speak up. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. No, it's. I think it's worse in the US than it is in the UK,
Uh,
because of the close
Tell me
links
about it. Yeah.
between, well, EPA and industry seem to have a kind of bit of a revolving door. You know, that you could argue that the EPA has been kind of more or less captured by the agrochemical industry. There's certainly a lot of close links between them, and universities in the US, in more so than in Europe, often have really close ties, often funded by, the industrial agriculture industry, which means that if you're, as a scientist, you speak up, you're upsetting the apple cart. Your bosses might not be happy. I've never discovered that in UK universities that I've worked at. I've never had pressure from the university to shut up. But I have, as soon as you put your head above the parapet, and say anything critical of pesticide use or GM crops. I don't usually say anything about GM crops because it's not my area of expertise, but for some reason the two often get bound together. You immediately become a target for the people that make these chemicals or the GM crops, and you come under attack, and it's not nice. I mean, I first got experience of this 12 years ago when we published our first paper on the impacts of neonicotinoid insecticides on bumblebees. And prior to that, I'd never really come across this kind of, influence at all. I'd been happily studying bees and their behavior and how if we planted more flowers in the countryside, there'd be more bees, and that didn't upset anyone. And so, it was all very uncontroversial. But as soon as I published a paper showing that these chemicals kill bees, then suddenly there were these articles appearing on, online blogs that were flagged up in social media, claiming that our science was poor, that we'd made up the results, that I was an activist and a scientist for hire, that you give me a few dollars and I'll say anything you like.
Wow.
Just basically trying to undermine credibility. And there seem to be 3 or 4 key figures involved, and they all sort of echo each other's opinions and make it seem like there is something wrong with you as a scientist, which of course is exactly the point. They do this all the time. It just recently, I don't know whether you saw the newspaper articles, but there was an expose that a former Monsanto executive had set up this company in the US that basically provides, it has files, it's kind of secret dossiers on more than 500 people, any scientist who's ever spoken out against pesticides or GM.
Wow.
And some politicians. And it basically, I saw the file, they had one on me, which these journalists sent to me. And there was nothing actually terribly exciting in it, but it was a compilation of everything negative that anyone had ever said about me. And they were all the same people, just repeating each other, really. But some other scientists, there was private information about their families' health, and all sorts of stuff that, was pretty sinister, that they're collating this information and selling it to, they're basically acting as a source of disinformation. If you want to know, how can I attack scientist X, Dave Goulson or whoever, then you go to that company and they'll give you all the dirt they've got. Really, it's
so sad.
And I guess I knew there probably was a file somewhere, but it was quite, interesting.
I wonder if I have a file now. If I don't have a file, I'm gonna be.
If you don't, you should be.
I'm gonna be pissed. I want a file too.
You might be there. So but it's a standard playbook. It's what the tobacco industry did for 50 years. They tried to sow doubt. They tried to say, well, actually, it's not really clear whether tobacco kills people. We're not sure. We look, this scientist who worked for us, he found smoking's fine.
Yeah, and they have a very big scientists going to Congress and speaking about defending the tobacco industry in the past, and now you know who is getting the money and being the.
Yeah. No, sadly, it's all kind of predictable, and we know how they work, but we don't really seem to have a mechanism for fighting it. And this weird world of sort of misinformation, fake news, and there are so many people believing extremist, weird stuff these days that
that's true. Yeah,
getting to the truth seems to be harder than ever at the moment.
We still need to learn how to use those tools for good, the social media. I think we are in the middle of a big experiment right now. Let's see how that goes.
Yeah, indeed.
Here in the United States, Professor, I think we're starting some movement on that direction. We have New York and Vermont states that are already passing some laws to phase out the use of neonicotinoids, for example. So I think people start to realize, but as you said, it's just the tip of the iceberg and might not solve anything because these things are replaced with others. But I think the main job here is to educate the people, because customers are the voters in this case. If they stop buying some kind of foods because it was, growth in a certain way.
I would say that I think that probably the more powerful argument, rather than telling people, these things are poisoning bees. Most people know bees are good, but they don't really care that much about bees.
Yeah.
But the fact that these chemicals are also in human food and that we're all being exposed to pesticides, and there's a fair bit of evidence that that's bad, it's hardly surprising. I mean, it's kind of seems like it's going to be obvious, but there is evidence, for example, that exposure to chlorpyrifos, which is a very commonly used pesticide around the world, impairs our brain development. There was a recent study that showed essentially that most Europeans have been exposed for decades to these things, and that we're all slightly less intelligent than we should be. There's fairly strong links with Parkinson's disease, with diabetes, with cancers like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, are all related to pesticide exposure. And I think that people start to listen when you say that. A really interesting study from Germany showed that 99% of about 1,000 German people that they screened had glyphosate herbicide in their urine. And the concentrations were much higher in children's urine than in adults' urine. That ought to make us pause for thought, surely. I mean, glyphosate, according to the World Health Organization, is a probable carcinogen. And, we're eating so much that it's coming out in our urine that's I'd say it's pretty alarming. But going back to the neonics, there was a Swiss study that found they analyzed the cerebrospinal fluid of 13 children, and all of them had neonicotinoid insecticides and neurotoxins in their cerebrospinal fluid. Again, what are we doing? I think most parents would be pretty unhappy to think that their kids are being poisoned. So there, I think maybe that's the more powerful angle to try and flag up to people. If you really want people to change if everyone changed what they bought, tried to support more sustainable agriculture, bought organic food and so on, then that could change the world. It probably won't, but it's worth a try, it seems to me.
Sounds good to me. And I have a list of lots of papers that I want to make videos about so people can know. Because I start to get terrified just reading these things and thinking about the potential possibilities. And I was even considering, you have so many investments in research and development to cure diseases, to create new drugs for Alzheimer, or to do something useful with a powerful tool, a controlled, powerful tool. Sometimes a medicine is important. If you find the perfect molecule that can help you somehow in a controlled way, I'm totally for it. And I would start to wonder how many of those clinical trials failed because there is so much other chemicals derived from the pesticides around that interact with that specific molecule in that trial, and then messed up the trial. And we could have a cure of something, and now we don't because the trial failed, because there is a mess of chemicals that we cannot control, and we don't care about controlling them. There's so much possibilities out there. It's just very scary.
Yeah, I mean, I just a little comment on that. I mean, I do personally think we need to put much more focus on prevention rather than cure, and that probably applies to human health as much as bee health.
I'm with you on that.
And of course, often the same companies that make the pesticides make the pharmaceutical drugs to treat the illnesses that we get having been exposed to the pesticides.
Yeah.
So they're, we're kind of locked into this system which profits them really nicely, but it's not doing us any good at all.
Yep. I take it this is one of the problems with capitalism, capitalism doesn't work for healthcare. A system that the product you kill the market, that's a problem with the system. We need a new system, or understand the system, the weaknesses of the system that we have, and find a way to work around that. That's why I'm pro free care, and move the research budget to cure. But the problem is nobody want to research something that's not going to provide some profits in the long run, which is a shame. Professor, I want to ask you something else. So you already mentioned about that a little bit, but I feel here in the United States the case is very bad. You feel safe at the university to speak out about pesticides where you are?
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I've had to develop a bit of a thick skin to put up with the sort of online attacks. But it didn't. Beyond that, my university, I've never had a message from the vice chancellor saying, I need to see you. I'm not happy with what you're doing. You need to
That's good. I don't think it's the case here. I truly don't think it's the case here. After 3 different universities as a postdoc and working at the USDA for 4 years, I saw things that make me 100% sure that that's not the case here. I have a former boss that published a paper about pesticide, and a couple years later, he's gone. Lost his job. People, very bad situation. I'm not gonna cite names, but many of this, and very few people talk. The only guy that talks about here is Scott McCart from Cornell University, and he has the guts to do it. And I'm clap because he's a very strong man. Because everybody else that I talk to here, they already in private, they tell me they're scared. They don't, because they receive messages from inside the university or inside the government, which is a shame. And so I'm wondering if there is any ideas, how can we protect the academics or the EPA personnel? The only people that people are going to listen to are the people that are scared to talk about. And there is a whole system to stop them to talk. And I was wondering, do you have ideas for me?
I wish I did. I mean, as I said earlier, I think the basic problem is that the universities in the US, many of them are much more dependent on income from industry.
Yep.
Big grants supporting the research that's going on there, big infrastructure developments and so on, all being sponsored by companies X and Y. We don't seem to operate in quite the same way in the UK. I guess historically, government funding for most funding has come from government rather than big corporations. So our universities don't have those close ties. But that suggesting that as a solution for your side of the pond is absurd, really, because you can't change the whole funding operation of universities. But surely there ought to be some way to protect academic freedom. So I don't know exactly how you do it, but it's absurd to attack people simply for speaking inconvenient truths. If they're scientists don't make stuff up. I've never yet come across a scientist who I thought was just making things up. There's no point. If a scientist is saying that they've got evidence that a certain pesticide kills frogs, kills bees, kills people, or whatever, then there must be some way of protecting them against that sort of insidious, nasty, secretive process that goes on behind the scenes, whereby they get a quiet phone call from their boss telling them to shut up, or worse still, their job's being terminated. I don't know how you do it, but I mean, if it seems to be fundamental to the operation of a good university that it should be able to protect its own staff and allow them to speak the truth. But don't have to.
Do you think tenure do the job?
I don't know. I mean, we have a different system over here altogether. You'd think that would help. I mean, people with tenure have more security. I don't know if it's still as secure, as high a level of security as it used to be in the US. I mean, there's not really any such thing as completely permanent jobs over here anymore. But as I understand it, once you've got tenure in the US, unless it's fundamentally changed, you do have a fair bit of safety. You can't just be got rid of. But there's an awful lot of people who hang on tenure track for a very long time, and they're the ones, I think, that are terrified of upsetting anyone, because they know that there are lots of other people fighting for tenure in their department, and only say one or two things, and block their copybook and they're out.
Yeah, I would expect after you got tenure, you probably do something more significant. But my observations are the opposite. When they get tenure, they just practically slow down.
Perhaps they're so exhausted by the process.
Exhausted, yeah.
Need a big sigh of relief. I don't know.
Yeah. All right, Professor, that was a pleasure. Do you have any message for the people here in the United States? My community is more commercial beekeepers and backyard beekeepers dealing with the problems we face every day with pesticides, with their bees. Do you have any message for these people?
I just generally, I'd say to people, do the little things you do matter if enough people do them. So simple things like, making your back garden, your yard insect friendly, plant some native wildflowers, don't use pesticides yourself, buy food, buy organic food, buy sustainably produced food as far as you can, support local producers, all these little things. But if everyone did it, would make a real difference. The insects in particular, they can thrive in quite small areas of land, and it's pretty simple to look after them, and they will recover really quickly if you provide them with the right conditions. Unlike things like giant pandas that breed very slowly, insects can breed fast, and all these insect declines could be reversed if we just changed what we're doing, which of course is easy to say and slightly harder to get everyone to do, but we could turn things around. We just need to mobilize enough people.
Right. Yeah, we need more people. Exactly. Well, Professor, it was a pleasure and honor to have you here. Thank you very much for your time and the great work you're doing. So thank you very much. And for you guys at home, thank you for watching Inside the Hive.tv, the show about bees. See you guys next week. Bye-bye.